The gavel struck the wooden bench with force, slicing through the suffocating tension that filled the courtroom. The silence was so absolute that the ragged breathing of some victims seated in the front row was distinctly audible. Richard Grayson, once a towering figure of power and wealth, sat frozen at the defendant's table. Gone was his smirk, his dismissive scrolling through his phone, his arrogant sneer. His eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto Judge Justice Lee, as though refusing to accept the words he had just heard. "Mr. Grayson," the judge's firm voice rang out, each word as sharp as a blade. "The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted into hushed murmurs. Some victims clutched each other's hands, silent tears streaming down their faces. Richard shot to his feet, his face flushing with fury. "No, you can't do this," he bellowed. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another powerful story, created just for you. But the sentencing wasn't over. Judge Lee met Richard's enraged stare with unwavering resolve. Additionally, all of your assets will be liquidated to compensate the victims. Richard stiffened, his lips trembling. He had always believed that money could buy anything, but today it couldn't save him from justice. Arrogance, fraud, and a spectacular downfall. Watch how a man's wealth fails to shield him from justice. The courtroom buzzed like a restless hornet's nest, tension splintering the air. People crowded onto the benches, shoulders pressing together, eyes flicking toward the defendant's table. Whispers rippled from one mouth to another, each rumor more scandalous than the last. Then he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray tailored suit, the man exuded an almost defiant confidence. His slick-back hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and he smirked at the crowd as though they had gathered to admire him rather than to witness his reckoning. Richard Grayson, a name that had dominated headlines for weeks, looked more like an honored guest than a defendant accused of embezzling millions of dollars from struggling families. But it wasn't his entrance that made heads turn. It was what happened when Justice Lee stepped into the courtroom. Clad in black robes, Judge Lee moved with quiet authority as she approached the bench. She didn't need to raise her voice or cast a stern glance to command respect. Her presence alone was enough. Her reputation preceded her, a judge of few words who valued justice above all else. "All rise for the Honorable Justice Lee," the court clerk announced. The entire courtroom stood. Everyone, except Richard Grayson. The silence was deafening. All eyes fixated on the defendant, who remained seated, flipping casually through a stack of legal documents as though the proceedings were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but Richard waved him off with a dismissive flick of his fingers. Judge Lee paused at the bench, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Her face remained unreadable, but the weight of her silence pressed down on the room. A murmur spread through the crowd, disbelief thick in the air. Who did he think he was? Yet, Richard remained unfazed, his expression smug, as if daring the judge to react. "You may be seated," Judge Lee said, her voice calm but resolute. She did not acknowledge the blatant disrespect, not yet. But the energy in the courtroom shifted. The tension was no longer merely present, it was suffocating. But this was only the beginning. Richard Grayson was about to learn a hard lesson, that even the wealthiest and most privileged were not above the law. Richard Grayson wasn't just rich. He was the kind of wealthy that made headlines. Luxury yachts, multi-million-dollar mansions on both coasts, private jets, and parties that could rival Hollywood galas. His business empire, Grayson Investments, had once been hailed as a beacon of financial success. But beneath the glitz and glamour lay a much darker truth. His rise to the top had been built on deception, promising small business owners and middle-class families a secure future. He convinced hundreds of people to invest their life savings into fraudulent schemes. Retirement funds, college savings, even entire family inheritances wiped out in an instant. The fallout was devastating. Families lost their homes, parents struggled to provide for their children, and elderly couples faced the terrifying prospect of living out their final years in poverty. The ripple effect of his greed spread far and wide. But to Richard, it was just business. When investigators finally caught up to him, the evidence was damning. Falsified bank records, forged documents, and testimonies from former employees that painted a damning picture of guilt. Yet, even as the walls closed in, Richard remained confident. "I have the best lawyers money can buy," he told reporters outside his Malibu estate. "This will blow over." It always does. And for a while, it seemed like he might be right. His legal team filed motion after motion, delaying the trial for months. They painted him as a misunderstood businessman, a scapegoat for the failures of others. But no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the mountain of evidence or the heartbreak of his victims. By the time the trial finally began in San Francisco, the courtroom was packed every day with people seeking justice, or at least a glimpse of it. Among them was Clara Martinez, a widowed mother of 3 who had lost her home after investing with Grayson. Her youngest daughter had been forced to drop out of college. Seated beside her was Samuel Vaughn, a retired firefighter who had spent decades saving for his golden years, only to end up living in his brother's spare room. Their stories, along with countless others, were laid bare in heartbreaking detail during the trial. Clara Martinez's voice trembled as she recounted the day she realized she could no longer pay her mortgage. "I begged them not to take my home," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they didn't care. My children had to sleep in our car for 2 weeks. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Samuel Vaughn's testimony was just as gut-wrenching. "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "And this man, he burned my future to the ground without a second thought." Through it all, Richard Grayson remained unmoved. He often leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone or whispering jokes to his attorney. To him, these were just stories, meaningless noise that would never change the outcome he believed was already in his favor. The press had a field day. Headlines screamed about his arrogance, his lack of remorse, the brazen disrespect he showed toward the court. Public opinion had turned against him, but Richard didn't care. As far as he was concerned, public opinion didn't write checks. His attorney attempted to control the narrative. "Mr. Grayson deeply regrets any hardship that may have been caused," the lawyer stated at a press conference. But he remains confident that the truth will prevail. The truth, however, was that Richard had no intention of admitting guilt. He was betting on the system to bend in his favor, just as it always had. But this time, there was one factor he hadn't accounted for. Justice Lee was unlike anyone he had ever dealt with. The trial was a spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, reporters jostling for position to capture every detail. Inside, the tension grew thicker with each passing day. One by one, witnesses took the stand, each hammering another nail into the metaphorical coffin of Richard Grayson. But it wasn't just the testimonies that stunned the audience, it was Richard's own behavior. On the 3rd day of the trial, the prosecution introduced damning evidence, a series of emails in which Richard explicitly instructed his team to falsify records and deceive investors. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read his words aloud. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line." The words hung in the air like poison. Clara Martinez, seated in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Samuel Vaughn clenched his fists. And Richard Grayson, he smirked. The prosecutor turned to him, their voice razor-sharp. "Mr. Grayson, do you recognize this email?" His attorney jumped in before he could respond. "Objection. This question has already been asked and answered during pretrial hearings." Judge Lee raised a hand, her expression calm but resolute. "Overruled. The defendant will answer the question." Richard leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, I recognize it. But don't pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and the judge's gavel struck like thunder. "Order in the court," Judge Lee commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. She turned her attention back to Richard. "Mr. Grayson, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting." But Richard was unfazed. If anything, he looked amused, as if this was nothing more than an elaborate game. As the trial progressed, his arrogance only grew. He scoffed at witnesses, rolled his eyes during cross-examinations, and whispered loudly to his attorney at key moments. The spectators watched in disbelief as he treated the courtroom like his personal stage. Then came the day of Clara Martinez's testimony. She stepped up to the stand, gripping a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. Her voice wavered at first, but her words carried the weight of deep, aching betrayal. "I trusted him," she said, looking directly at Richard. "I trusted him with everything I had, and he destroyed my family's future." Richard didn't even look at her. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling casually through his phone. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, pointing at Richard. The defendant is clearly not paying attention to the witness. All eyes turned to Judge Lee. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "Mr. Grayson," Judge Lee said, her voice measured. "Put your phone away. Now." He barely glanced up, unfazed. "I'm just checking something important," he said, holding up the device as if to justify himself. Her tone sharpened. I said now. For a brief moment, it looked like he might argue, but then, reluctantly, he set the phone down. The tension in the room was palpable, but the damage was already done. Clara Martinez continued her testimony, though her voice now carried an undertone of disbelief that anyone could be so blatantly disrespectful in such a moment. By the time she finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Richard Grayson. The prosecution rested their case a week later, leaving the defense to make their move. Richard's lawyers tried everything, discrediting witnesses, twisting the narrative, even painting him as a victim of overzealous prosecutors. But the cracks were too deep to cover. Through it all, Judge Lee remained composed. She rarely spoke, yet her presence commanded the room like an immovable force. But it was clear to everyone watching, her patience with Richard's antics was wearing thin. The trial reached its final day. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, the anticipation nearly unbearable. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised, cameras locked in place. The gallery was packed with victims, their faces a mix of anger and hope. All eyes were on Judge Justice Lee as she prepared to deliver her sentence. Richard Grayson sat at the defense table, his posture as nonchalant as ever. He even had the audacity to flash a small smirk at the cameras as they captured his every move. He didn't look like a man awaiting judgment. He looked like a man who still believed he had already won. Then, Judge Lee spoke. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice steady and deliberate. "You have been convicted on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims paint a clear picture of your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed the lives of countless individuals, all for your own personal gain." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Judge Lee continued, "Throughout this trial, you have displayed a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful. You have insulted your victims, disrespected the authority of this court, and treated these proceedings as if they were beneath you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clara Martinez, seated in the front row, clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Judge Lee's tone shifted, growing icier. "Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not about wealth, power, or privilege. It is about accountability. And today, you will face the consequences of your actions." The courtroom fell deathly silent. The only sound was the faint rustling of paper. For the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. He sat up straighter. "Therefore," the judge declared, "I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole." A collective gasp swept through the room. Richard's face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks. 25 years? He had expected a slap on the wrist, perhaps a few months in a luxury facility. But this was unprecedented for a man of his stature. And Judge Lee wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, "I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets to compensate the victims of your crimes. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the families you have devastated." The courtroom erupted into hushed, stunned whispers. Clara Martinez pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her face. Samuel Vaughn leaned back in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Richard shot to his feet, his face flushing with rage. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the room. "I am Richard Grayson. You can't treat me like some common criminal." The judge's gavel slammed down, unwavering. "Mr. Grayson, sit down." But Richard wasn't done. "This is a joke. I will appeal this. I will ruin your career." Court officers moved in, ready to intervene. Judge Lee remained composed, her voice cutting through his outburst like a blade. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson, and you will show respect. Officers, escort the defendant out." As he was led away, Richard continued to protest, his voice growing weaker with each step. The courtroom erupted into applause, a rare but fitting response in that moment. Judge Lee turned to the audience. Her expression softened just slightly. "Justice has been served," she said. "Let this be a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." But as the courtroom emptied and the cameras outside continued to flash, one lingering question remained in everyone's mind. Would this sentence be enough to truly change a man like Richard Grayson? The courtroom was nearly deserted, save for a handful of reporters and victims gathering their belongings. The charged energy from the verdict still hung in the air, but for those directly impacted by Richard Grayson's crimes, the emotions were far more complex. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Clara Martinez clutched her purse tightly. A reporter approached her, microphone in hand. "How do you feel about today's verdict?" Clara hesitated, then answered, "I feel relieved. But the truth is, no sentence can undo the damage he's done. My children and I are still rebuilding, but at least now we have hope. Nearby, Samuel Vaughn was speaking with a friend. It's not just about the years he's spending behind bars, he said, shaking his head. It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proved they're not. In her chambers, Judge Justice Lee sat quietly, gazing out the window at the crowd still murmuring below. She felt no sense of victory or personal glory, only a steadfast resolve. Her role was never about satisfaction. It was about fairness, about ensuring that justice could still be balanced, even against the weight of wealth and privilege. Richard Grayson's name would continue to make headlines for some time, but for those he had hurt, this chapter was finally closing. The financial restitution would allow many to start over, but the scars he left behind would take far longer to heal. In the weeks that followed, the case ignited conversations across the country. It became a rallying cry for accountability, a demand that those in power be held to the same standards as everyone else. People began sharing their own stories of injustice, drawing strength from the verdict. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from Clara's youngest daughter, Sophia, who wrote a letter to Judge Lee, later published in a local newspaper. "Thank you for standing up for my family," the letter read. "Thank you for showing us that people like Richard Grayson don't get to walk free after hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us a second chance." This story serves as a powerful reminder that no one is above the law, no matter how wealthy or powerful they may be. What do you think about Richard Grayson's sentence? Do you believe it is enough to bring justice to his victims? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might inspire others in their own pursuit of justice. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones. Together, we can spread the message of accountability and justice. Thank you for watching and supporting us. Stay with us to discover more inspiring stories. Wishing you strength and success in all that you do. Thank you for supporting our channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared to promote the values of justice and humanity in our society and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any inaccuracies, we appreciate your understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.